It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with everyone today. I want to first give a huge thank you to Portland Psychedelic Society for co-sponsoring this event. This is just some really incredible times that we're living in, where we're about ready to basically adopt the first set of rules for a legal licensed psilocybin program, really anywhere in the Western world. So this is kind of a big moment, and it's one that I think the fact we're all here means we all care about quite a bit, and so it's just really very timely, and this could not have happened had it not been for Kazari's work and kind of putting this together, and others on the Portland Psychedelic Society team, as well as Psychedelics Today. For thank you to both organizations for helping to sponsor this event and give a time to talk about these matters. So as probably many of you know, we are in the middle of a public comment period. This is the last chance for public to give any input onto the rules that will govern the products, testing, and training rules for Oregon's program. And so we have until Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific, that's April 22nd, Friday, to submit written comment to the state over the draft rules that it's published. After that, they're intending to adopt final rules in May that will be governing the program. So for people who want to be involved and participate in making their voices heard and let Oregon know about the issues that matter to them with respect to its psilocybin program, now is kind of the last chance, at least with respect to those issues. Wanted to kind of give a quick kind of update on where we are with respect to this Entheogenic practitioners proposal. So as I'm sure many of you know, we've basically drafted a proposed regulatory framework that would provide flexibility for communities who work with psilocybin under Measure 109. And the framework is modeled very largely after kind of the existing state of religious practice for psychedelic religions. And it tries to combine kind of the current kind of best practices with screening and safety that are kind of built into the Measure 109 model, while also combining that with some kind of religious liberties and kind of a set of relaxed rules that would kind of empower communities who work with psilocybin, kind of as an alternative to like a top-down medical model. I think of Measure 109, like the default option is we have these service centers that will probably, by most people's estimates, cost between $500,000 and $1 million to open. And then you have kind of a highly regulated set of products that have to be tested and go through kind of several chains of hands, usually before it reaches the client. And then at the end of the day, it's kind of a corporation or a company that sells products and services. And I think of that as very much a top-down model. And so the proposal for community use or religious or entheogenic community use really is more of a horizontal model that tries to give options to potentially keep as much money out of the provision of services as possible, both as a way to fundamentally just protect communities that use psilocybin and that work with it in a good way. But also, in the meantime, it also drives down costs substantially from kind of some of the other assumptions I think are operating under the rest of the program. So it's kind of, at the one hand, a community model that provides for kind of sensitivity to religious issues and cultural issues, and also kind of an equity access model, a community model for access. So without further ado, let's see if I can figure out how to share screen. Can you all see that? I'm going to assume yes. Okay.
We do see it. We see the side panel as well. But that's okay.
I can figure this out.
There you go.
Okay. How's that?
Excellent.
So when we talk about psilocybin and the potential benefits of psilocybin, they are many, and they are, when we talk about psychedelic healing in general, it appears, and of course this is all relatively new from the scientific research kind of point of view, but it appears from the research that the degree of mysticality of an experience, how strongly mystical a psychedelic experience is directly correlated to the mental health or therapeutic outcomes of use. And that's the data that we're starting to see emerge. But, this is, so I think society, as we are reestablishing our relationship with psilocybin and other psychedelics, there's a question of what is the container that is best suited for this. And there's several aspects of the quest for the optimal container. Part of that is the supports that are needed. Part of it is the safety profile, and part of it's the cost. Part of it is the perspective of the person using psilocybin. So with it being a largely spiritual or mystical type of healing that happens, there's kind of a common sense approach that says that a religious or spiritual community type of container for psychedelics really could be in some ways the best suited for that, or it could be one that is just kind of historically recognized. And it's not that, I want to make it clear, it's not that there's only room for one type of container. There's obviously room for lots, but the effort that we are going on here is to really create a community access model as an alternative to kind of the top-down, more medical looking, more therapeutic looking model. So for the particular framework, as we started talking about just a moment ago, there are a number of different kind of bases, or the framework for community use draws from a number of different sources. Part of it is just a general scope of psychedelic religious practice that's known today. We've drawn substantially from Santo Daime's practice. Jonathan Goldman from the Church of the Holy Light of the Queen has consulted on this and has kind of talked and given quite a bit of inspiration and feedback. And for those who don't know, the Santo Daime Church there in Ashland, Oregon, has been practicing above ground for a long time. They've been doing ceremonies for 25 years. And the information I've received is that they've not had any real safety problem or harm that has come in, all that time of conducting ceremony. And so, we have here in Oregon a really, a pretty well vetted model that balances the safety access kind of balance in a good way. We've sought stakeholder input. That's hard to describe because a lot of this still is occurring in either illegal or legal gray area kind of status. So it's, we don't really, I can't go into as much detail about this aspect as I would prefer, but there have been communities who work with psilocybin and other entheogenic substances that have given input and informed this. There's also, as many of you know, a DEA petition process to request exemption from the Controlled Substances Act for religious use. We borrow some from that model. Many of us who observe the DEA's process believe that they implement that in bad faith, being that they have never once granted an exemption in the years and years of them implementing that system. But still, the idea of an application and a petition and a request for exemption isn't per se a bad model, assuming it can be implemented in good faith and done, with integrity. The Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act has already established, broad protections for religious practitioners at the federal level. Those rights aren't recognized at the state level in many states, however. So even though back in 1993, when Bill Clinton signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law, they enshrined, strong protections for religions that use psychedelics. It was passed unanimously in the House, 97-3 in the Senate. So kind of, in that case, was a direct response, a direct kind of legislative rebuke and overturn of the Oregon v. Smith decision, where two members of the Native American Church, two peyote practitioners, were basically fired from their jobs for use of peyote. So that kind of sparked this national kind of turn of events that now enshrines those protections at the federal level, but they're not yet guaranteed at the state level. So this is a question that's come up quite often as I talk about this proposal. I get a lot of questions. Why do we need this at the state level when we already have these protections federally? And the answer is, based on our federalist system, we have these rights at the federal level. The federal government can't come and prosecute you for, bona fide religious activities under the RFRA, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But that doesn't stop a state law enforcement agency from coming and arresting you or prosecuting you or basically cracking down and punishing you for religious practice. So that's an important piece of this that I think there's I hear kind of some confusion about. Oregon has its own, we already protect religious use of peyote, even amongst non-natives. We are only one of 6 states in the country that allows people who don't belong to a kind of a Native American organization, like tribal affiliation, to have religious freedom for use of peyote. So we borrow from some of the language of that statute. And then, of course, Maria Sabina, the source of so-called magic mushrooms entering the Western world, we look to her for additional inspiration. And one of the key metrics of, I think, Oregon's program as we are trying to figure this out is we need to make sure that the program is not going to keep people out, both in terms of the type of practices that they engage in, assuming those are sincere practices that are done safely, as well as it needs to be affordable to people. If rural indigenous communities can afford to work with these substances in sincere contexts, it's really hard to see why any rational explanation why Oregon would have to charge thousands and thousands of dollars, with its program based on this kind of history. So we draw inspiration and wisdom from kind of the indigenous history here, and we hope to really put indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing kind of front and center at this in an attempt to have a decolonized program to the extent possible. Okay, so I think I'm gonna try to fast forward through some of this to make sure we have enough time, but there's some important safety regulations that are drafted into the framework here that I think deserve some mention. This has been another source of confusion as I've talked about this proposal to other people. Their safety is really kind of the linchpin of this. We've incorporated a number of important aspects that would essentially, provide safety within this context of, community practice. Of course, and many of these are already built into Measure 109. So we have mandatory screening of new people. We have, basically disclosing the risks and obtaining informed consent. There's a client information form people have to fill out. There's things to prevent diversion and to punish, if there were diversion from the regulated system into the black market, there's stuff to kind of deter that. A big thing is preventing abuse. There's been a lot of media going around right now about how underground psychedelic practice is just rampant with abuse and harm. Part of this is, as organs weighing safety, one of the key factors here is not just to think of the safety problems within Measure 109, but to think of the safety problems outside of Measure 109. One of the assumptions I make in bringing this proposal is that it is generally safer for people to take psilocybin within Measure 109 than it is to take outside of Measure 109, because of these screening procedures, because of the complaint and the disciplinary oversight for abuse, because people can call police without having to risk being arrested to the same extent, also to contact medical emergency medical personnel if something happens. And these are all things that when people operate underground, they don't feel as comfortable, as safe accessing. So that by itself really does represent a significant improvement and increase of safety than is available in the kind of underground. So those are kind of some of the important pieces. Although we talk about this being religious freedom, the Oregon Constitution actually protects both religious and non-religious individuals and activities. So this would actually give essentially the fastest growing religious self-identification in the United States right now is people who identify as spiritual but not religious. Many of us have religious trauma. Many of us have given up on religion as a sense of, the dogma and the judgment. And, a lot of us think that it's religious institutions have become self-serving. So the framework protects essentially the people who identify as spiritual but not religious, but still would want to work with psilocybin in a sincere kind of community manner or way. And as one of the other pieces of feedback I got back on this was there's plenty of people who identify as not spiritual, who have what they identify as a contemplative practice. And this would, of course, cover, basically atheists who don't believe in spirit and who object to the term spiritual, but work with it in a community kind of framework. And so that's kind of the overview. So when we start digging into the particulars here, one of the key factors is that Measure 109 presents a number of kind of hard, I call them non-negotiables. They're things that Oregon really has no regulatory authority to deviate from. So these are things that no matter what kind of regulations Oregon ultimately adopts, these things would have to be, present in that system. And here's a list of them. And essentially, a lot of these are things that, even if Oregon rulemakers were very, very sympathetic and wanted to, accommodate religious practice and kind of culturally sensitive practices, there are some limits on how far they can go based on, these statutory requirements. But that leaves, however, a large number of other things that are negotiable. And so what this proposal is a way of trying to gather some of these things that are consistent with community practices, so that, that we can just create kind of a ceremonial container, a community container that's both affordable and kind of is in line with current kind of practices, with a hope that if we make this program affordable and flexible enough, that we can actually attract some of, like as much of underground practice to come above ground as possible. So if we have a program that's too expensive or too restrictive, that just won't happen. So the call here is for Oregon to attract more people above ground. So this is a big point. If Oregon does as much as it can do legally under the measure, it's still less than is already there federally. And what's there federally was achieved through years of struggle, through high-level court cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. It included the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so there's been decades at this point of hard-fought struggle to get to where we are today. And we hope that Oregon will take note of the fact that this is kind of a civil liberties issue. This is a social justice issue, and that Oregon will act in accordance with kind of it's generally usually pretty good policies around these types of issues. So we mentioned this earlier very briefly. If there is more protection already federally, why would people do it locally? It's because there's no state law that would protect prosecution from any type of psilocybin religion or any type of other psychedelic religion, with the narrow peyote exception. So that's another big piece. Like if there were a bona fide psilocybin church or religious organization today operating in Oregon, even though it could be 100% legal under federal law, it would not be legal under state law as it currently stands with Supreme Court precedent of the Oregon Supreme Court. So, so that's another big sticking point, is that there's no current legal way for a person to practice with psilocybin in a sincere religious context. So as we mentioned earlier, horizontal community model with safety and oversight and accountability through OHAs kind of being there. It's also tries to get affordability, and it does this through three basic devices. One of which is peer support assistance. This was drawn in large part from the Santo Daime model of in-ceremony support, where they use community members to, look after community members. This would be combined with the presence of a facilitator. So under the measure, you have to have at least one facilitator, but the ratio could be flexible. So this tries to increase the flexibility of that ratio, particularly for communities that have experience and, like there's no need to have, facilitators if the community is self-sustaining and, once the community has kind of developed its internal competencies, it's able to do that. So then the other two big pieces of this are the liberal rules for products, which would allow communities to grow their own mushrooms in a way that kind of keeps it as much out of the general stream of commerce as possible. Now there could still be things that, track products to make sure that diversion's not happening. And people would still have to report the amount of mushrooms that are grown and dispensed and that sort of thing. But to keep it on site there out of, not having to be tested, which is a big piece of it, as we'll get to here shortly. And then the other kind of key piece that I wanted to talk about was these communities that would be given these privileges under this model must be organized on a not-for-profit basis. They could either be nonprofit organizations, not necessarily 501c3s, just because with the illegality of psilocybin at the federal level, that creates some complicated legal issues. But under Oregon's law, if they can be organized on a not-for-profit basis, or community cooperatives would be the other option under the most recent version of this proposal. One of the drawbacks is that because of the four corners of 109, we won't be able to accommodate all practitioners. People who work with substances other than psilocybin wouldn't have access or a legal pathway under this. And I mentioned that just to acknowledge that there are some significant limitations, but this tries to get kind of the most in terms of civil liberties as we're able to get under the measure. Let's see, keep moving here. So yeah, this has been the most affordable access route of access that's been proposed so far. There really hasn't been serious discussion of other ways to drive down the cost. Oregon has already kind of made established a policy of administratively supporting sincere entheogenic practitioners during Santo Daime's process before they sued the federal government. They went to the Oregon Board of Pharmacy and asked for basically a letter saying they wouldn't try to regulate daime or ayahuasca as a drug under the purview of the Board of Pharmacy. And the Board of Pharmacy ceded and wrote a letter kind of agreeing that it didn't have jurisdiction to regulate it. So even though that's not legally binding precedent, it is something that I think Oregon should consider, as they've already kind of, established kind of a precedent for that. And then, because this brings underground practitioners above ground, it reduces potential for harm and the availability of resources. So now to get to the rules. So the last day, as I mentioned earlier, is Friday to comment on these. We have a petition circulating where you can sign. We've already gotten over 300 signatures on this, but if you haven't yet and you'd like to support this, you may do so by signing the petition. I think there'll probably be a link for that in the chat here. But essentially, with the particular rules that Oregon has put forth about, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of regulation. And throughout Measure 109, there's several references to kind of this tension between safety and also affordable and equitable access. And so that balancing act between, on the one hand, being really safe, and on the other hand, being like affordable and equitable and promoting access, is those two, there's a perception that they may be at odds in some ways. One of the priorities of Measure 109 that's actually listed directly in the measure itself is that, there has to be planning to make this, to make it and keep it, an affordable therapeutic option for all persons 21 years of age or older in this state for whom psilocybin may be appropriate. So one of the challenges here is, if this is truly going to be available for all people and all people in this state, that means that it can't be thousands of dollars where only tourists from other parts of the country or parts of the world come. Meanwhile, the hundreds of thousands of Oregonians who are living in poverty can't access it. So this is written into the measure that this is a priority, that all people have access. And that's something to consider when thinking about the affordability safety balance that we really want to, that's the target we're aiming for, is everyone should be able to access it. And because regulations have the overall effect of driving up the costs, there should be an attempt that the regulations really serve some specific articulable purpose, something that really goes to the heart of the program. If it's going to drive up the cost, it better drive up the cost, just not for some arbitrary reason, but because it serves an important purpose. So what this gets at is regulations that don't address safety risks, but drive up the costs, perpetuate an unjust system because, as we'll see, expensive means unjust because it means unaffordable to lots of people. And that just perpetuates the inequities that already exist along our societies in many different lines. So what that means specifically for testing is the proposed rules would develop 6 different types of testing: species testing, potency, solvent testing when psilocybin is extracted from the mushrooms themselves, pesticides, contaminants, and heavy metals. So the way that for the community framework, we have what I think are a couple of very modest and minor deviations from the proposed testing rules, but they're very important. Under the draft rules from OHA, species would have to be tested once each year, and potency would have to be tested every batch. Solvents are the same. We haven't changed anything with the solvent testing, but all the others are only required upon written request. So the specific request that the proposal makes for entheogenic community use would basically relegate all types of tests to be only upon written request for certain reasons, one of which is if you have to test, since these rules here would have literally every batch of mushrooms tested, it really would give a significant economic advantage to large-scale growers. If you have to pay the amount, an amount to test a large batch versus a very small batch, the cost of the test gets, concentrated more heavily for small growers, which creates a system where it becomes really hard, particularly if you have to, if your model were to have only a small community grow where you grew just for your community and no one else, every time you'd harvest mushrooms within a 24-hour period under the proposed testing rules, you would have to, in theory, send some of those mushrooms, not in theory, you would actually literally have to send some mushrooms to get tested that are harvested outside of the 24-hour window. So that really it would make it extremely difficult from just a pure economic perspective to make that an economically viable option, and it would almost certainly, create a system where almost all of the mushrooms that are consumed in Oregon's program come from large-scale grows. So in Oregon's equity statement, they made some very interesting statements here. They said that the test of costing, quote, could ultimately be passed on to clients, unquote, which seems like an acknowledgement, but not really potentially assuming like full responsibility for what results would come from testing. So, they say that, less restrictive rules could carry a lower cost of compliance for manufacturers. However, lower costs would be coupled with higher risks of negative outcomes for clients, including health and safety concerns. So they never really attempt to identify what these higher risks of negative outcomes are from untested products, particularly on the potency where they're trying to make every batch. I've yet never heard of a person who's had an adverse health outcome based on an untested mushroom. So, exactly where they are raising that, what kinds of outcomes would come from something that is not tested or not tested as often, really, it doesn't seem to like serve an exact purpose related to safety. And then they have this other statement here that seems also sort of puzzling, that an appropriately regulated market creates consumer confidence and encourages members of the public to access psilocybin services through the Measure 109 model rather than unregulated markets. And so the idea here is that somehow by having products be more tested, they think that's going to drive, they're saying that's going to drive, people into the service center. However, it's also going to drive up prices, which will drive people back into the unregulated markets, I think more so. I mean, I think if anything, these more onerous rules here are going to have the opposite effect of what Oregon's saying in its impact statements. And this is the one that was, I think, most kind of offensive. Testing rules are likely to impact lower income clients more acutely because the cost of testing could be passed on to clients receiving psilocybin services. There is no data available to suggest that racial populations will use psilocybin at different rates. So this statement here is at odds with, as their racial equity statement, it misses a really important piece of the analysis. In Oregon, 13% of our citizens live in poverty. 4 in 10 of those live in what's considered deep poverty, which means half of the poverty line. The poverty line, so it means, just to put this in scale, 516,000 Oregonians, and in the deep poverty, over 210,000. These numbers are, hard to reconcile. If this is, 520,000 people living at this or below these lines, this is the population that we need to make sure, if Oregon's program is not going to perpetuate inequities, that it's accessible to these people in these income brackets. These numbers aren't distributed evenly amongst the population. They disproportionately affect BIPOC communities with, Black Oregonians living in poverty at over twice the rate of white Oregonians. And you can see just kind of how these issues are not these numbers are not spread evenly. When we add people who experience disabilities, the numbers get even more stark with Black Oregonians who have a disability being nearly 50% living in poverty. So one way of thinking of a really expensive, over-regulated psilocybin program is that it would keep half of all Black Oregonians who have a disability, make it really challenging financially for them to ever access it. It's probably would be unrealistic for many people living in poverty to be able to access the program. Same thing with single mothers. Single mothers also living in poverty at higher rates, particularly BIPOC single mothers. 1 in 2 live in poverty in Oregon. It's also 30% of transgender Oregonians live in poverty, and poverty disproportionately affects people living in rural areas, some as high as 23% in Malheur County, where I live. So in light of the poverty issues and the safety, affordability, accessibility, equitable access balance, how does this play out with testing? Well, so as far as I can tell, with the safety concerns about testing, the issues here really go on the imprecision in dosing, at least under the 2 testing rules that the entheogenic practitioner's proposal would relax. What are the risks of imprecise dosing? They probably affect microdosing more, since it's more critical that the dose be exact on a very low amount than it would be for it to be exact on a higher amount. But that's something that communities could probably manage, particularly where you're being supervised at a service center. So, that the question is, what are the safety risks if Oregon doesn't require testing, like potency testing, for every batch of mushrooms that's harvested within a 24-hour period? And so far, I've not actually heard a single, legitimate what I would consider to be a legitimate safety concern that untested products are going to result in harm to the public. So when we balance that with the equity piece, where it drives up costs without really serving a safety issue, disproportionate impacts on BIPOC communities and other economically disadvantaged communities, advantages large grows over small producers. The balance here is just a little bit different than I think this way the state's trying to draw it, particularly where state has announced its goal to end all health inequities in the state of Oregon by the year 2030. So it's kind of at odds with that. I came across this really kind of challenging artwork, just the gentrification of magic mushrooms, which I found to be very kind of impactful. Just paints a picture that I think none of us here really want to see. And then the other aspect of kind of the racial intersection, or one of the many, I should say, aspects of the racial intersection with Measure 109, is that there's recent research showing that psilocybin can be used to potentially treat racial trauma. Monica Williams and her team, have shown that one of the risks or the challenges is that we already see extremely low participation levels of BIPOC communities within psychedelic research. And there's growing concern that even once these substances become available, BIPOC communities may choose not to make use of them, in part for some of these reasons. So I just want to emphasize that the financial impact of this, is not just financial, it also cuts across other lines. It's really important to note. And then with respect to the religious angle, it might be a fair question, why is testing a religious issue? Well, first off, potency testing really reflects this Western medical view that psilocybin is reducible, like the mechanisms of action are reducible to pharmacology and biology. And that is a very Western view that is not really reflected within, indigenous or, I couldn't purport to speak for indigenous communities, but my understanding of them, as well as, more Western religious traditions that, trying to do some kind of math problem and figure out the exact number of milligrams is kind of at odds with this kind of a more spiritual approach to using them. And as I've talked around about this proposal, I've actually been informed that some communities actually don't want to know how much, exact psilocybin might be in a mushroom, because that kind of adds to kind of the mystery of it. And I'm not sure I could articulate it better than that, but that's been something that's kind of emerged from my talking around these issues to other people. So it really imposes this Western paradigm on psilocybin while not necessarily actually promoting a clear articulable safety interest. And basically it would, almost certainly stop most, if not all, communities from being able to, grow their own mushroom, their own sacrament. And so we're running out of time here, and I want to just talk very briefly about the products rules apart from the testing rules. There was the draft rules would limit only the program only to using psilocybe cubensis. OHA in its statement, its health equity, racial equity statement, even recognized that there are some problems in doing this potentially. And, it says, while communities have historically produced and consumed psilocybin products in a manner inconsistent with the rules that could be adversely impacted, that they're based on public health and safety recommendations. I'll say I've attended virtually or very nearly every meeting of the Psilocybin Advisory Board and its 5 subcommittees over the last 13 months. And the only real safety concern I've ever heard raised from different species was around the woodlover's paralysis issue. That's not been indicated in hardly any species, just a small number of them. And for them to just sort of blanket prohibition on any species, particularly where they even recognize Psilocybe mexicana as a species that has a long and established history of indigenous use. They're claiming that they don't know whether any of these indigenous people, members of these communities, are in Oregon, and using that as a basis to prohibit them completely. So that's challenging. And then I'll just say very briefly that the other issue around products itself, besides species, is just around kind of culturally sensitive and religiously sensitive manner of growing. Communities ought to be able to grow their own, to handle their own, and store their own in ways that kind of are consistent with their views around these. Many people who work with psilocybin in sincere ways believe that there could be like a kind of a sacred aspect to the mushrooms themselves, and they don't really reflect this westernized view that it's just a plant. Like many think that the fungi is itself a sacred object and worthy of respect. So with that, we will open it up for questions.
And this will be interesting. I've been doing things, I have not been watching the chat. I believe for people to verbally ask a question, which is what you had wanted, John, we will have to change their status to panelist. So was anybody watching the chat to know who wants to ask a verbal question?
I'm just reading through these now.
Hey, John, do you want to go ahead and give them all the information about signing up for the petition? And I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. You didn't do that.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. So we have a petition. There's a website for it. I'll post it in the chat here momentarily. So there's 3 ways we can give public comment right now. We're doing this petition. We think that's the fastest and most convenient, but also the least effective method of letting your voices be heard. We will submit that petition and share it with OHA, but it would be better to email your own comments to OHA, even if that's just one short little line saying, I support religious practice, I support community practice, spiritual use. 49% of people who filled out Oregon's community interest survey said that they were interested in taking psilocybin for spiritual purposes. So this is really, half of people who responded said this is a subject that interests them. So if you can send an email to Oregon by Friday at 5 Pacific, that will be one of the most impactful ways for you to let your voice be heard. The other way that's probably the most impactful would be to actually come to the public comment hearings, which are Monday, the 25th, Monday tomorrow, from 5 to 7 Pacific. There is an advanced sign-up sheet, and I will post that in the chat here too. And then the other comment period for the verbal comment is on the 21st. That's this upcoming Thursday, from 10 to noon Pacific, and there's a separate, a different sign-up sheet for that.
Isn't that Wednesday? And I'll point out that actually your website has all of these information, all of these things on it. So the OregonEntheo.com has all that information. So that's a good place to go. It's not super obvious because the top part of that page is the text of the measure, which might be a good way if you wanted to have a template to talk about what to support.
So there is the link to the petition, and I'll say we have already been able to get 2 subcommittees to vote in support of this proposal. The licensing subcommittee voted on it 4-1 to adopt it, or to recommend adopting it. And the equity subcommittee also voted 11-0 to support its adoption. Despite that, we have had some signaling, I guess you could say, from the state that they are uncomfortable with it for reasons that haven't really been clearly articulated. There's not been really any clear safety issue described that would arise from entheogenic practice that I've heard that would be like an actual factual reason to be, challenged by it. I think the most resistance that I've heard, if I could characterize it, it would be that this is disruptive to the way they had conceived of the program, which, given the equity issues and the other issues and the civil liberties issues, the fact that, the mere fact that it's different than some people had envisioned it being is not itself like a valid justification. So we think the more time people have to wrestle with this and to conceive of it differently, the better it is. And then the more support people show for it, the more, the more our voices are heard. So
John, if you wanted to take some audio questions, it looks like Arishta and Paul have raised their hands. Would you like me to?
Yeah.
One of them to speak. There we go.
Hey, Arishta.
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it's probably written someplace, but I haven't been able to find it, is for religious practitioners. I'm assuming the state's going to require us to go through their facilitator training course, regardless of this proposal or not. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's not technically a state training program. The state will,
well, state mandated.
Yeah.
Right? They're gonna have the format. They're gonna have everything, and then you try to find somebody that you can afford. But we're already getting some feedback, or we're seeing some indications that these courses are going to be extremely expensive.
Yeah, that is a significant limitation.
So what it brings up is that for those of us who have been facilitators for years, I'm going on 19 years now. So, here we're being taught by somebody that literally knows very little other than what they've been told to say and how they've been told to teach the course for facilitators. But more to the point is that so as a religious facilitator, am I going to be restricted in the format of which I then facilitate the psilocybin? Am I going to have to do it their way?
So we don't know what the final rules will be yet. One of the things that the proposal would allow that's not really clear under the general rules of the program would be that ceremony, and this would be obvious to probably most people here, but I don't think it was obvious. It may not have been obvious to people at Oregon Health Authority, at least initially, is that, for religious context, usually ceremony is led by a person who is under the influence of the sacrament. And so
okay, that's not true for the way I was taught, but
well, and there's, why this is the other part of the proposal is that it tries to cover a wide variety of practices. So it wouldn't require, a ceremony to be led by a person. But there would still have to be people, facilitators who are licensed and trained, who are not under the influence, who are standing by and still able to, provide the safety oversight.
Of course, but in the actual facilitation, the actual, in our case, ceremonial use which is going to be different than the therapeutic use.
Mhm.
Those standards, which are now being written up in the rules committee, are, there's obviously going to be wide variation between the religious and the therapeutic.
Mhm. So there's not really much in the rules yet that, at least in this draft or in the measure itself, and I guess I should make sure I clarify, none of this is legal advice. This is just general information, so don't take this as legal advice. But there's not really anything in there currently that would prohibit. I see Peter Addy asked about non-directive approach. Measure 109 doesn't actually require non-directive approach. It requires that facilitators be trained, that the facilitator training gives special attention to non-directive approach, and that there be other, recommendations from the board about non-directive approach, but it doesn't actually require that services be administered in a non-directive manner. So what that means for your question is a facilitator could, unless OHA adopts a rule that requires it to be non-directive, the facilitator could lead in a directive manner if they're not taking sacrament, or a peer, like a client, could lead ceremony while on sacrament, while the facilitator is, involved with that part of it. So it tries to strike, create flexibility so that communities can work with psilocybin in ways that they're already working with it. Does that answer your question, Arista?
Pretty much. There obviously still a lot to be determined, obviously. Final follow-up is I guess we'll just cross our fingers, pray, and hope that your proposal is accepted.
Thanks. Yeah. We've had some good luck so far in terms of both recommendations from the subcommittee, and we've got, David Bronner just came out and published a blog in support of it, and I'll put a link to that here in the chat a moment ago. He published his comment to OHA, his public comment he published. And then we got Bill Richards, author of this book. I don't know if you can see it, this silly Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experience. He's a researcher at Johns Hopkins. He just came out in support, or I wouldn't say in support, but he wrote a comment that seems to support religious community access model, not specifically the proposal, but just the idea of there being a non-medical container that's a valid container. So that was also really significant, but we still need your support. The part of this is we want people to write in. So if you haven't yet, I just posted the email in the chat. Please consider sending an email to this address by Friday with your comments. We have on the Entheogenic Practitioners website a kind of a sample. It's basically the language from the petition that we invite people to kind of copy and paste and edit to, suit their views on things. And, a letter an email is much better than signing the petition, but it's better that they hear from you at all. So even if it's something just very short, like I support entheogenic practice, I support religious use, I support community access. So even if it's just one line, it's important that they hear from us. So
awesome. Yeah, I just prompted people to, I'm about to go do that myself, and then I'll celebrate in the chat by saying, I just sent an email. But Paul would like to say something, ask you a question.
Hey, Paul. Oh, we can't hear you, Paul, if you're talking.
He is unmuted, so we should be able to hear him. I don't know if he might have an audio issue.
But while we're waiting for him, there is a question, John. Will this quote therapy be covered by OHP?
So Dr. Carter, Angela Carter, gave a really great talk for PPS just last Thursday. And they presented a really interesting model about how peer support could be used to possibly bill Medicaid for some of the prep work and maybe some of the integration work. I don't know how likely that is. That may have just been an idea, but it was one that really got me excited because that would, open up access for lots and lots of people if that worked out. Otherwise, there's not been serious talk that this would be available through OHP or anything like that. So yeah, that's just kind of a hard thing. I think this part of it's because it's really new, and once MDMA becomes available through the FDA, then I think that becomes more likely that access could be had of some type of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic healing through insurance. But for now, those prospects are pretty bleak. Is the best information I have on that.
Okay, next, we could unmute Sasha.
Hi there, could everyone hear me?
Yeah, hi Sasha.
Hey there, John. Good to be speaking with you. I wanted to ask if any organizations have stepped forward to help with any potential sort of tip line or some sort of organization that's willing to investigate claims of impropriety from facilitators.
That's a wonderful question. I am unaware of any currently. I've heard talk of that. I don't know if there might be someone else on the call here who could speak to that better. I'll say the Entheogenic Practitioners Council is considering, planning essentially to have some kind of a complaint system where we provide kind of review of complaints like that, because I think it is a real need. And, I think if we start doing things like this voluntarily, it becomes easier and easier for the state to say yes to us, because we are behaving ourselves, safely and responsibly and ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you know, Sasha, of anyone doing that?
I remember hearing talk about Fireside potentially being involved, but I don't think that turned into anything. If anybody on the board is well connected to Hanifa, Miss Hanifa Washington, that would definitely be a wise move to make. Fireside definitely has some great resources, and if there's some way that we can maybe raise funding for them to have people that are assigned to that tip line that can safely monitor those messages so that the process is gone about in the right way. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. We've identified that as a real need, with things being like they are. And, thanks in part to your work on, spreading the word about Brandon Begley and his death, and just the fact that we really need to do a better job of policing ourselves, and making sure that if we don't police ourselves, then somebody else will. So, why would we want that to happen ever? So, we just have to do it, come up with mechanisms of accountability, even for underground practice. But with practice under 109, that's one thing the state would be really excellent at doing, is providing that kind of oversight and complaint system. So, I'm hoping that there can be kind of dialogue about that to make sure that that's ran in a good way, with particular attention to power dynamics and people's suggestibility. And there's just a lot of these ethical issues can get really tricky pretty easily. So yeah.
Thank you for saying that. I had just one more follow-up question. If entheogenic practitioners are able to practice under Measure 109, that OHA accepts the recommendation, is there a possibility that the DEA could come in and let's say the DEA doesn't have all their ducks in a row and they don't realize that the licensed Entheogenic Service Center is actually licensed by the state of Oregon, and they actually think it's just an underground church? Will there be some sort of legal protection for those churches?
Well, that's
or
kind
other
of
service centers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So ordinarily psilocybin practice under Measure 109 will be illegal under federal law.
Yeah.
There's a potential narrow carve out where if there's a license holder who's operating legally under 109 that also satisfies the RFRA standards, and would whether or not they apply for a DEA exemption or receive one, if they comply with the regulatory system through the state, and they also comply with the federal RFRA kind of analysis, then between those two, they would be, in theory, 100% legal at the both state and federal level. I say in theory because there is potentially some gray area with that. Law is just not always black and white, and sometimes you have to go all the way through court to find out whether a judge agreed with that you're religious or not validly. But assuming you can meet, pass that scrutiny at the federal level, you could have it kind of at both levels.
Thank you for sharing that. I'll leave my questions to that so everybody else can have some time.
Thanks, Sasha.
Hey,
All right.
John, can you address the subject of calling this therapy versus supervised psilocybin sessions?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. So the question is, what is therapy? And therapy could mean a lot of different things. People talk about massage therapy, people talk about, music therapy or play therapy or art therapy. And, what does that mean? What psilocybin therapy means isn't known yet really clearly, from a legal perspective. And if the mechanism of healing through psilocybin therapy is this kind of spiritual type experience, that's, that it seems like a spiritual kind of therapy is the best I can, wrestle with it. And that's not psychotherapy, but under the measure, there's a few things that make it clear that Measure 109 is not just a psychotherapeutic program. To be a facilitator, you only have to have a high school diploma, plus, licensing under the measure. People don't have to have any kind of diagnosis in order to access services. And, they don't call them therapists, they call them facilitators. They don't call them patients, they call them clients. So there's just that kind of thing of what does psilocybin therapy mean? And, the campaign used the term therapy just because that they did polling data and that was what resonated with voters. But it's not like therapy in the sense of it being like psychotherapy.
And I think Paul's got his audio issue dealt with. If you'd like to
Do I?
Yes. Hey, Paul.
Good deal. John, Paul Indorf here. Good to see you. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for all your work. A lot of people might not understand that you built this from the ground up, and there is no other proposition for religious views. But a concern I have, and that others have, is around, again, safety. That is to say, there have been issues where on some occasions, individuals have been hurt. And I just wonder how I guess the concern is, or would be on the part of regulators, is that religious use kind of really opens kind of the floodgates to a lot of less qualified people being able to, administer. And I just wonder if there are any safeguards that are built into this, or that could be built into this, to address those concerns. And that said, I will say also that one person who's injured gets tremendous media coverage, whereas thousands that have been helped kind of go unseen.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. So I think the first and probably most important safeguard against what you're talking about, unscrupulous actors, is Measure 109 itself. As Arista raised earlier, a facilitator is still going to, an entheogenic facilitator, or under a community model, still has to go through all the same training and all the same licensing as a regular facilitator. So it's not that the people who will be administering facilitation will be any less qualified than any other facilitator. They'll be the same kind of class of facilitators. So that's a big part of it. And then I think, with all the same screening and, intake kind of requirements as the rest of the program. So the hallmarks of Measure 109 safety piece, all of those are a part of this program too, but with some notable, relaxed pieces that just drive down the cost and prevent the unnecessary expenditures. So one of those is peer support within ceremony, where a community gets to, and this is where, we drafted into the model an opportunity for communities to certify their own community members who are experienced and trained, and, to be able to offer peer support in ceremony. There's something in the measure or in the proposal that would allow the state to regulate that and require that the person that would be providing, peer support services in ceremony have to meet certain metrics. It could regulate the certification of a person is ready to provide peer support. And if this made the state uncomfortable, like they could do that. And I tried to put that in there to give them something that if they were a little leery about it, that they'd have that option built in. But yeah, those are two of the ways that we address that. And the third was kind of mandatory disclosure of the ability to file complaints with the state before, like during screening. Like that'd be a standard part of the process, is that all clients have to be told, if you have an issue with us as the facility, you're able to complain to the state. Here's how to do it. And then the community would also be required under the proposal to have its own internal safe complaint system for somebody who didn't necessarily want to take it that high, but wanted some kind of process a little bit less than that. And they're the only piece of the proposal says they can use a restorative justice model as long as they make it clear to the client that, participation in a restorative justice model isn't required, that they can still, it's like it's an optional participation. So that's that's what we tried to do to strike the safety, flexibility, affordability, access balance there.
So wow, we might have actually gotten all the things in. We've got maybe 10 more minutes till the official end of this. How are you feeling about everything, John?
I'm feeling really good. I just want to really encourage people, like right now, like if you haven't yet, we need all the support we can get. We need people to show up and let their voices be heard. I keep referring to Measure 109 as a people's law. It was enacted by volunteers and donors to overturn an act of the legislature which said psilocybin has no place in society. People rallied together, overturn that through the ballot initiative. And so, I hope that by the time we get to the program, it's still a people's law and that it's still reflective of the will of the community. One of the concerns I have about cost is, as I volunteered for the campaign, as I'm sure other people in this room did, the volunteers who donated their time to the campaign may not be able to afford access into the program that they spent their time volunteering to help make a reality. And so it's just part of this kind of absurd expense thing of like thousands of dollars to access services. I've heard the state try to say, we don't regulate the cost of services, we only regulate the activities. And it's like, it just feels like such a cop out, to be honest, an avoidance of taking responsibility for an inaccessible and unaffordable program. So yeah. So I'm feeling good about it. I hope folks will, so you've got the 3 ways you can sign the petition. Please email and please show up to at least one of the hearings to give verbal comment. If we could have 50% of the people who comment either at the verbal hearings or in the written comment be people saying, we support entheogenic practice, it becomes really hard for the state to act like this isn't a significant issue. I mean, we want to remove any excuse the state has for not doing this. And so the more we speak out, the harder it becomes for them to try to sweep this under the rug. So this is still, despite its problems, this is still kind of a democratic society, and this is a public comment period, and they're asking to hear from the public. So, as kind of the psychedelic community or the psychedelic communities, we are the stakeholders here who fought for this program. So, I hope we can continue to advocate that we make this program one that serves us as people, not just business that wants to profit off of this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise, and you took it on. You've built the whole framework, and we just as a community, we really, really appreciate your efforts. And I think a lot of people from what was happening in the chat have signed up and signed the petition and sent emails. I did put the end of event links in the chat if you'd like to donate to PPS, if you'd like to volunteer, those sorts of things are in there. And Mike, if you want to come back on and check in as Psychedelics Today, you could, or I guess John, you're representing Psychedelics Today. We're very appreciative. They did promotion through their venue and social media and whatnot, and we did as well. And I didn't really realize that I think it's Easter today, maybe. So maybe that's why it's a little bit smaller of a group, and it was kind of short notice, but we got a good turnout. And two, John, maybe you could remind me what Angela said. There was some time period that won't be ending, like this is ending shortly, the comment period, but is it the rules aren't gonna go to OHA until later?
So there's actually 2 different rulemaking periods. There will be another one for the rest of the rules. Like I mentioned earlier, this is just products testing and training. So the rest of the program will go through another public comment period, I think in October. And so I've heard rumor that we're supposed to get a vote on the entheogenic practitioners proposal at the May meeting. So that's a month to really hit your community, hit your network, really need to just show up in a big way and please share the petition with your networks on your social media. The more people, the stronger we are. So, this is our chance.
Would we get a second bite of the apple, if that's the right metaphor? Because equity is one of the subcommittees that's not going to be done yet, because this seems like this is an equity issue, right? I mean, sort of.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's
Really?
absolutely an equity issue. I asked OHA leadership there recently about this public comment period and whether the rules that get adopted here will be binding, because there are aspects of the proposal that touch on products and testing, obviously. And I asked whether the outcome of this round would preclude future consideration. And they didn't give as clear of an answer as I would have preferred, but they said the way I understood it is expressed a willingness to consider it, particularly since I think the proposal was first offered in early February, and the whole recommendations for these other set of rules were finalized by the board in November. So they really, none of this was considered at all in the prior, in the draft of rules that they're looking at right now. So the hope is that if people, deliver passionate, comment and speak with, force and with conviction about these things, that it'll really open up the board's eyes to how important this is. And I'll say, for people who are giving public comment, particularly at the two hearings, the fact that the person right before you or 5 people right before you said the exact same thing, it's still worth saying the same thing again, because repeating the same thing is not, that's actually good for them to hear that multiple people have the same thought. So I think a lot of times people think, well, someone already said that, so I'm not going to say it again, but actually do. if somebody else took your point, don't be afraid of being a copycat or whatever. It's encouraged that you continue to share your thoughts.
Because even whatever comment you make, I don't know what the formula is, but it does represent to them 500 people or 50 people or something that have that. So and if it's a multiple thing where everybody's saying the same thing, it just underscores how many people really agree with that point.
Yeah. Any other questions about public comment or anything about the proposal?
John, I just had one thing. I think you've already said it a few times, but I just want to make sure there are deadlines for the petition and the email, right? And they are April 20th and April 21st.
Yes.
You have to do that by then.
So the technical last date for the written comment is 5 p.m. on the 22nd. I think the website says 21st just because somebody wanted to make sure it got in on time, and many people procrastinate, but get it in now. I mean, there's no reason to wait unless you're just really taking time to craft a very careful, thoughtful comment. Do it right now, so it gets done, and make sure.
Which we probably all have, but if you're sharing it with your friends, then hey, don't wait a few days. You do have a few days, but after that, deadline's over.
Yeah. The two, it always folds back into there is no time but now. So now is the time to do that. Casey, you want to say that?
Someone asked about getting a copy of the slides, John.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to share them however is easy.
One way to do that is to send them to me, and I can put them on the Google Drive and create a link to that.
Perfect.
Propagate that by putting it as a comment on the listing for this event. That's a good way to do that.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your support. Thank you for calling in, for not calling in, but writing in, emailing in, doing public comment, signing the petition. This just means a lot. And, you know, no one can do this in isolation. Like, it takes a whole community to make something big like this happen. So thank you all for supporting this work. I think together, I feel like we can make history together. You know, if we speak our minds and speak our hearts, and you know, this is our chance to make history together.
So I think maybe we'll call that an official goodbye, and we will see you on another Zoom another time. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, John and Mike and Kasari. Awesome, awesome job.
Good night, everyone.